In just a few moments, I will yield the podium to Chuck Palahniuk, who will speak and take questions until 2:30. Given Chuck's love of minimalism, I kept the following introduction to fewer than 500 words. Chuck's bio is printed in your program, and I encourage you to learn more about him and his work, and of course, to read his books and interviews and essays. No doubt, though, many of you already know something about him. Maybe you're familiar with one or more of his characters, often desperate, sometimes angry, always distinct and unforgettable people, or his plots, which are, to paraphrase the author's own description of what readers want, full of movement with verbs on top of verbs. Or you've seen a particular film adaptation and you make jokes like, the first rule of writing workshop is you do not talk about writing workshop. Or maybe you've heard that several dozen people have fainted at his readings, that fainting was, for a while, something of an epidemic at Chuck Palahniuk events. Or you're a card-carrying member of The Cult, his comprehensive online fan site that gets over 700,000 page views a month and has 30,000 registered users on its forum. Or, if you're like me, one of the first tales you heard of Chuck Palahniuk was of his extraordinary generosity toward his legions of fans, his fellow authors, and aspiring writers. That he answers every piece of fan mail he receives, that he sends impromptu gifts to strangers, that he'll come to a place like Grub Street with which he has had no association because we asked him nicely and because he believes that what we do matters. The fabulous Amy Hempel, who's seated here today as well, and who is one of Chuck's significant influences and great friends, recently reminded me of Chuck's famous generosity, how he promotes the work of fellow writers as much, if not more vigorously than his own. Given that Chuck's platform is so strong and far-reaching, there is no doubt that he has changed the course of many emerging and established writers' careers for the better. One of the reasons for Chuck's generosity may stem from the fact that he began writing in workshops similar to Grub Street's when he was in his mid-30s. I read in an interview that, like many of us, he wanted to be a writer since 5th grade, and also, like many of us, he had a teacher, in this case, a Mr. Olson, who inspired him. According to the interview, Mr. Olson said, quote, "Chuck, you do this really well, and this is much better than setting fires. So keep it up." Those words, Chuck has said, made him a writer. One critic called Chuck Palahniuk, quote, "a master of depicting the dark and depraved underbelly of our society through the voices of mordantly existential protagonists," end quote. Like any such definition, this one is inherently limiting, despite its sincere attempt to encompass the breadth and depth of a writer with such a singular aesthetic, who continually exhibits a great passion for characters of all kinds and whose devotion to research ensures he gets the details right. I'm delighted and honored that Chuck, it seems like longer than 500 words, I know, I promise you I counted. I'm delighted and honored that Chuck Palahniuk accepted our invitation to join us today. I want to thank him and Amy Hempel for making it all happen, and mostly I'm excited to hear what he has to say. Please join me in welcoming Chuck Palahniuk.
Notice how that just rolls off the tongue so easily? The fabulous Amy Hempel. Those two words just belong together. 3 words, okay. Fabulous Amy Hempel. I'm not usually invited to speak at events where people are actually eating food. And in a way, it kind of doesn't matter what I'm going to say here. No, it really, really doesn't. Because if you are going to be a writer, there's nothing I can say that will stop that. And if you are not going to be a writer, there's nothing I can say that will make you be a writer. So if you're going to be a writer, that's pretty much already set in stone. And if that is the case, I really want to congratulate you, because there are a lot of things to do in the world, and there is laundry, there is dusting, there is shopping for food. There are all of those things that you have got to do in order to have that 10 minutes or 20 minutes to be a writer. And you all have managed to do all of those things. You do everything, and you get it done, and you do this. And most of the world doesn't do that. Most of the world is just happy to get the baseboards dusted. Good night. And you get it done, and you allow yourself enough time and energy left over to do this. And that in itself is remarkable. That doesn't just naturally occur in the world. You live a very disciplined life, and you make that happen. So, congratulations, because that is not most of the world. And I wish I could sort of teach you a great, huge truth. You know, something really giant and practical that will absolutely change your life. And I can't do that. I'm not very good at that. So instead, I'm going to teach you how to avoid an embarrassing faux pas while you're in France. Because there's a very specific way to eat certain cheese in France. And I messed it up. And I will have to live with that moment for the rest of my life. And if you listen closely, I'm not going to teach you anything gigantic about writing, but at least you will know how to eat this certain cheese while in France. A few years ago, I was on a book tour. And especially when they ship you to someplace overseas, they have paid so much money to get you there that from the moment your plane lands, they have you scheduled out, especially if it's Germany. In Germany, you get your itinerary, and there's a 5-minute break, and it says, Mr. Palahniuk goes to the bathroom. But what if Mr. Palahniuk doesn't have to go? You're going to go to the bathroom. But in France, it's not that bad. But the moment you get off the plane, I'm in a hotel room, and there's a photographer waiting in the hotel room. And he's got a camera, and I've been on a plane for 17 hours. And he says, it's okay, I've got a halo flash. It's what we use on Catherine Deneuve, so her face always looks so completely smooth. It lights you from every direction so that you, no matter how tired you look, the halo flash makes you look like an angel. But I've scoped it out, and the only place that we can take your picture adequately is in the bathroom, because it has this white tile. So I'm in France, I've just stepped into my hotel room, I haven't slept in 48 hours, I haven't eaten, I don't speak French. This photographer speaks very little English, and he says, I need you to lie down on the floor next to the toilet. So I'm lying on the floor next to the toilet, and he's saying, no, don't smile. You don't look very attractive when you smile. Your teeth aren't very nice, are they? So I'm laying on the floor in a French toilet, being told that I'm unattractive. You'd be amazing how easy it is not to smile at that point. And then the publicist comes in, and the publicist, Juliet, says, I've got some personal news I need to relay to you. Your cell phone is not receiving over here, but your grandmother has just died. And my grandmother, we call her Grammy, and she just died. And now, regardless of what people may teach in these seminars, the primary purpose of the publicist in publishing is to inform you that your loved ones have just died. Because in 1999, I got a call from Megan at W.W. Norton, who said, Hi, this is Megan. We've got you confirmed for that Newsweek article, and Time will be calling. Oh, and they found your father's dead body. They need his dental records. And that's how I found out about my father's murder. And now, 10 years later, I'm laying on a French bathroom floor being told I have weird teeth and being told that my grandmother has died. And there is no place on the itinerary where it says, Chuck cries his eyes out, or Chuck throws up. And they have paid a buttload of money to ship me over there. And if you're raised as a good kid, you know that when people treat you nicely, you behave really nicely. And it's kind of a blessing at that point that every 15 minutes is scheduled, because I don't have to do anything. And I'm going to miss the funeral, which sucks. But all day long we do this. All day long I don't smile for people. And that night, I have to go to a big fancy dinner party at my French editor's apartment. And everybody there is French, go figure. And they're all speaking French. And I don't know any French. And they're all smoking cigarettes. And they're all yammering away, and they decide that they're going to teach me one thing in French. They're going to teach me to say, red before white, and you'll be all right. White before red, and you'll wish you were dead. It means you always have to drink red wine before serving white wine, because if you drink white wine first, you're going to have a fantastic hangover. And they're trying to teach me that in French while they're all fantastically drunk. And they make me repeat it over and over at this table filled with cigarette smoke. And I still haven't slept, and it's going on 36 hours. And I have no idea what they're saying to each other. And I am just getting angrier and angrier because it's getting later and later. And tomorrow morning, I have to wake up in Paris and do all of this all over again, something different every 15 minutes. And I need to do that for the next 5 days. And during that time, I'm going to miss my grandmother's funeral. And I'm going to miss being with my family. And I just want to kill everyone present. And I feel so much like that little dog in The Great Gatsby. Do you remember that scene? Where Myrtle and Tom meet surreptitiously on the train on the way into New York. And leaving Grand Central Station, Myrtle says, I want one of those stray dogs that man has for sale. And they buy this little puppy, and they take it up to this sort of love nest that they've established. And that little puppy is sitting there while everybody smokes and drinks and dances, and eventually Tom busts Myrtle's nose, and there's blood all over the apartment. And throughout that whole scene, that little puppy is just sitting there in the center of all that chaos, wondering, what is going on? So I'm feeling like that little dog. I'm sitting at this table with all this smoke and all the chattering and all the French shouting. And I'm feeling like that puppy, the thing that is completely isolated and alone in all of this connection. And tomorrow morning, I've got to wake up and sparkle, Neely, sparkle. And all of them, I'm understanding, they're all debating, they've all been heroin addicts at some point. And they're fighting among themselves about who got whom addicted to heroin. And periodically throughout the evening, they're going into the bathroom and they're shooting up. So now they're strung out, drunk French people smoking cigarettes who have no understanding of the fact that I have a lot to do tomorrow. And my grandmother just died. And I start begging for a ride back to the hotel. It's getting really close to midnight. And I am just begging anybody who's leaving the party, anybody, just please, I'll ride. I don't care what you're driving. Just get me back to the hotel. And I finally hook up with these two incredibly strung out people. And I get in the back of their tiny car, and we start out. I've never been in Paris before. And they're so high. And their car just sort of drifts to the curb and stops. And then they start it again. And they arrive at red lights, and the red lights turn green, and they don't go. We sit there at these green lights until they turn red again. And traffic just kind of flows around us. And finally, we gain some speed. We cross the Seine, and we arrive at the base of the Eiffel Tower. And suddenly they're going very fast, and they bump up onto the curb. They actually drive up onto the curb. They park sideways on the sidewalk. And there are police there. And they jump out of the car, they leave the doors open, and then they scream, "Run, Chuck, run, we've got to run." And the police are there, and my stoner friends are racing across the plaza. And so I jump out after them, and I'm chasing them. And they're running under the center of the Eiffel Tower. And they're still screaming, "Run, Chuck, run! We must run!" And the police are chasing us. And we arrive under the very, very center of the Eiffel Tower, and they stop. And I am so out of breath and so tired and so strung out. And they scream, look up, Chuck, look up." And I'm staring straight up. And when you're under the Eiffel Tower, it's huge, it's gigantic. And at night, it's all lit up. And when you look up the center of it, it's like a big tunnel. It's like a big kind of square tapering tunnel that just sort of tapers up and up and up into infinity. So it really looks like you are looking through a tunnel that goes forever. And it is blazing, blazing bright. And there's very few people in the plaza, but they're all screaming. They're still screaming, "Look up, look up." And my head is planted all the way back, and I'm looking straight up. And suddenly the entire world just vanishes. Everything goes completely blackout, oblivion black. And the only thing I can hear is the kind of collective gasp of these stoner people and the police and the handful of people who are standing there, just this huge combined inhale. And vertigo kind of hits me because all of my points of reference have vanished. And I feel my knees buckle. And I lose my balance and I fall down to the concrete. And so I'm kind of cowering there on the concrete in the middle of all of this blackness. I've gone completely, totally blind. And in that moment, I hear my grandmother's voice. And she says, "This is why we're alive. So we can have experiences like this." And I am so glad it is totally dark, because I start crying so hard. And it turns out that all of that French prattle among all of those unpleasant French-speaking sons of bitches, they were all conspiring the entire evening on how to get me to the base of the Eiffel Tower at exactly midnight, because that's when they shut the lights off. And it's one of the most dramatic, incredible experiences you can have in Paris, is to be standing under the very center looking straight up as the entire world vanishes into nothing. And all of that stoner behavior, that waiting at green lights, that parking on the curb, even that last second rush was to get me under the Eiffel Tower at that moment when I would be out of breath and completely angry and confused. And I'd like to think that in a way, it's a metaphor on so many levels. On one level, it is a metaphor for writing. That writing itself is an act of faith. That you have no idea how your work is going to turn out, or whether your work will ever bring you a tangible reward. But you still do it, and you still trust that piece of work is going to turn out better than you could ever anticipate. You cannot really control your way to the kind of success that just seems to magically happen. And on another level, I'd like to think that that's what life is about. That is, on some level, it is a conspiracy to make you more incredibly, joyously happy than you could ever imagine. And that at the point someday when the lights do completely go out, you will find that it was all for a very noble, incredible surprise, and it was all set up to make you really happy in that moment. And one of the reporters I talked to on that trip, he was telling me about his favorite song. He said it was a song from like the 70s, and he could never quite understand it because it was about a girlfriend who was always would steal food from her boyfriend. And I didn't really remember that song about how she was stealing his food and he was starving. So I said, "Could you sing it for me?" And he said, it goes like this. It goes, "Every time you go away, you take a piece of meat with you." And I probably shouldn't have told him. Because I think, that is another tendency that we have this, especially as writers, this impulse to make order out of chaos, to take things and to impose a meaning on them, a profound, deeper, ultimate meaning on them. But, maybe it wasn't my grandma's voice. Maybe when we die, we die. Maybe it was just an incredible moment under the Eiffel Tower. But I didn't promise to teach you anything profound. I just promised to teach you how to eat this cheese the right way. And part of the way through that French dinner, they had brought out this big wedge of brie. And they put it in front of me as the guest of honor. They said, "You have the first brie. You have to cut the brie." And I reached over and I cut the tip, the little small pointed tip off the brie. And they all started screaming like French parrots. And suddenly they all knew English and they were screaming, "So the greedy American, so typical of the greedy American's behavior. The American who will eat the best of the entire world and leave the rest for everyone else." What? And they explained that when you cut brie, you have to cut the entire length so that you take a tiny fraction of that point, because that's the richest, softest portion, but you also take your share of the rind. And what I had done was just basically take the very best of the brie. So, what have we learned? We have learned that your publicist is there to inform you that people you love have died. And we have learned red before white, you'll be all right. White before red, you'll be better off dead. You'll wish you were dead. And we have learned how to eat some brie in France. And that's it. That's all I got. So, but I'm happy to take a stab at some questions if you've got questions. So, and it doesn't matter, whatever questions you ask, I'll answer the questions I wish you had asked. So. For Choke, my personal research was mostly going to Sexaholics Anonymous 3 times a week. And it was just amazing. It was so incredible. I love looking for patterns among groups of people. And among the sexaholics, it was general contractors that for the most part, 60 or 70% of the sexaholics would be general contractors because they operate out of their vehicle. They have a very flexible schedule where they can take off a half hour in a day to go to a massage parlor. And they kind of, that's why your kitchen's not done. And they told the kinds of stories that you will never see on television and that you will never see in the movies. And that they tell those stories in a very sort of oral history tradition, a spoken language, a storytelling way, because it really is a sort of theater in which people polish their storytelling skills. They want to engage each other. They want to have an effect as they tell those stories. And so the people in those groups, who have been in those groups for a while, are really accomplished, incredible storytellers in a way that, kind of in a tradition that we have lost because we don't have, sitting around and telling each other story time anymore. So if you want to hear great stories, and stories which tend to be told incredibly well, support groups are a very good place for that. My teeth are just as brown and snaggly as ever. And with the angel flash, everybody, your nose just looks like two holes. So you kind of look like Grace Kelly or a Nagel print, where you just have two dark little holes in the center of your face. No, that's the other thing is you work really hard to avoid seeing pictures of yourself. But I'll try to paraphrase the question and get myself off the hook. The idea is that in starting a book, to build in an emotional scam, a way in which people get their emotional needs met through an inauthenticity. And in Fight Club, it was the narrator going to support groups for terminally ill people and allowing them to assume that he was also terminally ill, so that he would have the affection and the closeness that occurs in those groups, and that those people would be with him within a real immediacy that really only people in the face of death have. And, working from there, that the social contract is that inauthenticity has to be resolved, and that character has to be humiliated and revealed in front of that peer group that's been deceived. Same thing in Choke. Choke is about a man who pretends to choke in restaurants and allows people to seemingly save him, and in doing so have a moment of incredible heroism, where they're also in a way embracing him and weeping over him and in a way adopting him as a child, at least for that scene, for that moment. But the problem is when going into the end of the second act, all of those people who have been deceived contact each other and recognize that what they thought was the greatest moment of their life, the moment that they saved a human being from dying, was actually a moment in which they were manipulated and used. And so the whole inauthenticity, the whole kind of structure of what looked like love collapses. And maybe it's just projection, but I think that pretty much everybody figures out a way that they can make people like them. When you're really little, you think, if I'm just really smart, I'm the smart kid, or I'm the really strong kid, or I'm the really funny kid. And that's going to work for me. And that works for you, and that works for you, and that works for you. But toward the end of your second act, you start to realize that that's going to be it. You're going to be the funny person for the rest of your life. And it really stops working for you. It starts to break down. And I've been the funny person for most of my life. And that's, in a way, my inauthenticity. That's the way I've learned to be in order to make people like me. And that's a great way to be. But it just, it doesn't work for me anymore. And I think, that's what I try to do with a character. Start from an inauthenticity that's already in place, work to the point where the diminishing margin of returns is such that the character is willing to abandon that way of being, and in that moment has a possibility of being really anything. But for the first time in their sort of deliberate adult life, choosing a way of being rather than just being this extension of a 2-year-old who decided, when I'm sick, people like me. So I'm going to be sick for the rest of my life. So, thank you for the sneeze. It's like having a friendship with God. You can't really call it a friendship. When I started writing, it was in a little workshop taught around a writer named Tom Spanbauer's kitchen table. And Tom had 3 students, and we met every Thursday night at 6 o'clock. And Tom would give us copies of Amy's stories, starting with The Harvest. And we would read these stories, and they would just ruin us because we couldn't go back to reading 98% of the fiction that existed in the world because we had been exposed to this high-grade, uncut, really pure, incredible work. And line by line, Tom would dissect them, and he would say, this is why this word is here, this is why this line is here. That every moment, every aspect of this story is contributing to the fact that you feel something at the end and you're not sure why you feel it. That it really acts like a magic spell. And so, right from the get-go, we just adored, and not even Amy Hempel, but Amy Hempel's work. And it was sort of the truest, highest thing we could aspire to. And so it is kind of an unreal joy to actually meet Amy Hempel in person. But in a way, it's also a nice affirmation because it proves that this isn't just a deity. This is work created by a human being. And that the human being is actually sweeter and nicer than the work itself. So, you owe me $50, Amy. I wrote a really terrible novel. It was 800, 900 pages long. It was really just a reeking waste of trees. And I'd sent it to an agent, and then I called this poor man almost every day. Have you read it? Have you read it? Have you read it? And finally he said, no, he's some polite euphemism. It doesn't fit my list. No, he finally said no, ultimately. So I sent it to another agent, an agent in Seattle, and I phoned her, and I phoned her, and I phoned her, and finally she said, there are aspects of this novel that I found to be really deeply troubling. And I prefer to represent work that I really adore and I feel a close connection to. And there were just parts of this book that I just found too objectionable. And without thinking, I said, I can change those parts. I can change them. You just let me know which parts, I'll change those. And she said, well, actually I found the whole thing deeply objectionable. And I heard myself say, well, I could change the whole thing. I could change it all. I could write exactly what you want. And in that moment that I heard myself say that, I thought, why don't I just bend over for the whole world? There's a choice where you realize, am I going to do something that I love to do, the way I love to do it? and hope, out of the hope that it makes other people happy? Or am I going to do something that I love just because I love to do it? And do it in such a way that every time I go back to doing it, it feels like a party. It feels like just a blast to do. And take my reward on the front end rather than hoping for a reward on the back end. And that was the moment that broke it up, when I said I could change everything. And then stopped myself and then said, no, from now on, I'm going to write at parties. Instead of using writing as an excuse not to go out, I'm going to use writing as an excuse to go out. I'm going to go out, I'm going to go to every party, I'm going to go to every social occasion, and when people say funny, clever things, I'm going to go in the bathroom and write them down. And I'm going to use writing as an excuse to be in the world and enjoy my life, instead of an excuse to kind of hide out and be alone. And Invisible Monsters was the book that came out of that, and it was a blast to write. And Fight Club was the book that came out of that same practice, and it was a blast to write. So that's still my philosophy is the process itself has to be its own reward. It has to be more fun than anything else you can be doing at that moment, or you should be doing that other thing. So, and with Monsters especially, I think it really shows. So, thank you. That is a really great question. And it takes us back to Amy Hempel. With a short story, it is such a great way to learn how to write, because you can really take it apart like a little machine, and you can keep the whole thing in your head part by part, and you can analyze how each little bit of it works. And so when Tom taught us writing, he taught us with short stories by Amy, by Tom Jones, by Mark Richard. And these are the people we really studied, because you could take their work apart and see exactly what part acted as kind of a hook or a lull or a setup or just a beautiful piece of writing, a beautiful passage. And so a short story was really how I started writing, was just short stories. And also I think because Tom came from kind of an acting background. He was in a group called the Bowery Theater in New York. And so a lot of how he taught involved kind of performing your work. And in workshop, people have to read their work out loud to each other. And that's when you hear exactly when the work gets its most spontaneous feedback, when people laugh or they groan, or you hear them gasp. In that moment when they realize the thing that's not being said on the page, they make the connection that the author is not overtly stating. And so you get that completely unfiltered, spontaneous feedback when you read out loud. And conversely, you also hear where the work doesn't work, where it gets draggy and boring, and it becomes expository, and the dialogue is just too much of a tennis match, and you're completing the energy too thoroughly. The people aren't no longer engaging because the tension is completing itself ongoingly. So short stories you can read out loud, and they function as a self-contained unit. And that was another reason to teach using them, because they could be presented in totality within workshop. So, and then ultimately, when writing Fight Club, I saw that I could take short stories and I could present them and sell them separately before I even had the book complete. And I could sell, I think I sold 6 or 8 chapters as short stories to magazines. And then ultimately, when I had the whole thing, I only needed to write a few kind of bridging scenes to hold those short stories together in a story arc. And at that point, it was much easier to sell, because I could say 8 chapters have already been published in different lit mags. So short stories have always been really my highest priority. The agent thing was easy, because in Tom's workshop, once I was producing work that was good enough, and Tom wouldn't be embarrassed by me, he said, why don't you send your work to my agent? And so I sent my work to Tom's agent, who took me on right away and didn't sell my work initially, but within a year had sold Fight Club for me. So I got my agent through Tom, through my teacher. And rejection, recently I went through all my banker boxes, and I really threw everything away. Everything. And there was a whole banker box full of rejection letters. And I thought I would keep them forever and paper the walls with them. But it seems kind of pointless now. So, but I was stunned when I saw just what a huge volume of them there was. But they're gone now. So, though I would say I got maybe 35 pounds of rejection letters. There's a book called Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. And if you carry that book in public, every woman who doesn't know you will come up and gently grasp your jacket and say, that was my favorite book for years. And so I've been reading a ton of Judy Blume books. And I now know how it feels when a high school boy who didn't really love you that much breaks your hymen. Yeah. And I know pretty much all there is to know about menstruation, so. But the Judy Blume books are kind of piled up around my place because I have a book for next year, which is based on the structure of Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. Because I think it's a kind of a beautiful updating of a very 19th century novel structure, where you have a kind of preamble like Dickens used to do. Chapter 1, David Copperfield goes across the prairie and whatever. And then you have it unpacked. You have the kind of unfolding of that summation. And in Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. It's, dear God, it's me, Margaret. I went to school today. I made some new friends. I think I even met a boy. And it kind of tells us in that real summary about what we're about to see. And it's really an interesting form to do that. And so I wanted to write a novel about a little girl who's 11 and wakes up in hell. And she's going to be in hell for all eternity. And she's not even sure why she's in hell, but she's going to make the best of it. And so it's like, kind of like the Breakfast Club set in hell. And I needed to study Judy Blume. And the book was originally called Margaret, my book. And Judy Blume's a Random House author, so my book is now called Damned. But Judy Blume books are all over my place, and I've pretty much read all of her young adult stuff. And I'll do that. It's a kind of Tom Spanbauer trick it's also a sign of Asperger's syndrome, but to fixate on one thing and to reread it or to fixate on one song and listen to it on repeat for months and months and months until you can kind of figure out how that little machine works. And it's a real skill of kind of focusing on this thing beyond the level of entertainment so that you can really dissect and figure out exactly the function of each aspect of it, how each element contributes to how that thing functions and ultimately has its effect. And so at this point, I'm not reading Judy Blume for content. I'm reading her to be able to parrot her, to mimic her really well. The film adaptations, it's really fascinating in that, again, the social contract is that if you deceive a group of people, you ultimately have to be revealed to them and achieve a status beneath them. You have to be kind of humiliated in their presence. And in Fight Club, eventually they end up back at the support groups where she says, "You're not even sick." And he says, "Well, you're not sick either." And they realize in that moment that they've humiliated themselves in front of their peer group of people who are sick. And that in this moment, the peer group has the option of either accepting them despite the dishonesty, or of rejecting them, shunning them. And David Fincher couldn't shoehorn that into the movie. He said we were at 2 hours and 20 minutes. We couldn't revisit that social deception. So in a way, they couldn't complete the social contract. And I think that's a big obligation that has to be done. And ironically, that's kind of the only thing I found wrong with the Choke movie, was that there had to be a scene where all of those people who had been deceived into thinking that they were heroes learned the truth and had the option of either punishing or accepting the person who had deceived them. And the director, Clark Gregg, said, "You know, we ran out of money. We really couldn't have that scene." And so in a way, I think the only thing I would change about both of those stories, both of those films, is the thing that they do have in common, that lack of completion of the social contract. The overall inauthenticity has not been resolved. And I could speculate that it has something to do with acting as well, where the actor has to be so literally there that they don't want to lose that level of sympathy. They don't want to be that fully kind of humiliated. And so I would speculate that in film there is that tendency to avoid that ultimate sort of destruction of a character. And that's the blessing of books, because a book costs so little to produce, it's consumed by one person, it doesn't have to be loved by billions of people to make some money. And so that's why we write books, because there are things you can do in books that are incredible that you can't do on television and you can't do in motion pictures. When Fight Club was coming out as a book, I went to a family reunion in Hamilton, Montana, which is about an hour south of Missoula. And the irony is that I'm kind of defining a new place by a no place. But Hamilton is where my family is from. And we were all sitting outside the motel drinking beer one evening, and my brother-in-law's, "So, what'd you get for that book? What'd you get for that book you sold?" And I say, "Why do you want to know?" He goes, "Because I want to know whether it's worth my while to write a book. My time's pretty valuable. And if I don't want to be wasting my time writing some book if I'm not going to get paid a lot of money." So what'd you get paid? I got paid $6,000. That was my advance on Fight Club. And God bless, but I've since found out that that's what they call kiss-off money. That if there's someone at the publishing house who really, really loves a manuscript, but the house itself doesn't love that manuscript, they'll offer a very, very low advance, hoping that the author will be insulted and walk away. But they didn't really take into account the fact that I'm stupid. And I just went, "Oh, $6,000. I could buy a car." But I was so embarrassed that I didn't want to tell my brother-in-law that, because I knew that's what he would say. And so I just sort of went, "You know, this is a work that you do for love. You do this work out of a deep passion. You don't do this work because you want to make a lot of money." And I changed the subject instantly. But I still think that that's my purpose, is that if there's something that you enjoy more than writing, you need to go and do that instead. You know, I will never regret the time that I spent with my dogs. It's not the most productive time. Nobody pays me money to play with my dogs. My mom died last year, and I spent a year taking care of her while she died of lung cancer. Boy, there wasn't much pay tied to that, but boy, that's a year that at the end of my life I will say, nobody paid me to be there, but I am really glad I was there. And so there are some things that you do, and you do full out, and that half the time are incredibly unpleasant things. But they're still the right things to do. They're still the things that when you reach the end of your life will provide you with the greatest comfort upon reflection. And as a comfort and a fulfillment and a satisfaction that money will never, ever know. You're never going to reach the end of your life and say, oh, I sold a book for... No, that won't even be there. So if you love to do it, you should be doing it. If you don't love to do it, there's something else. The hideous first novel, what was it about? It was about a group of friends who had illegal illegal domiciles in a building that was zoned commercial. They had illegal lofts set up in it, so they had to sort of live outside of the system, or otherwise they would be evicted by the city. And creepy horror things started happening in this giant old building. So it was basically a Gothic novel set in a loft warehouse where zoning was the main threat. But you know, the best thing about even the shittiest work is that you can go through it and you can lift little bits out of it. And there was a scene where one character had a monologue in that book where it was one of those morning after sex scenes, and she was sort of reflecting, and she said, you know, the condom is the glass slipper of our generation. You put it on, you dance all night with a stranger, and you throw it away. The condom, not the stranger. And I was able to lift that out of that really stinking mess of a book and put that in Marla Singer's mouth in Fight Club. And so it was such a joy whenever I hear Helena Bonham Carter say that line. I know that there was a little part of that book that survived. And there was another part that I parted out like an old automobile. You all done eating now, so. There was a scene where a guy was obsessed with a woman, so he bought a blow-up sex doll, and he groomed it in such a way that it looked as much like her as possible. And then he sort of went through this ritualized seduction of it and intercourse with it. But as he had unzipped the back of its dress, he had snagged it. And part of the way through coitus, he realized it was going flat beneath him, and that he was going to have to complete the act as quickly as possible before it turned into a giant wrinkled pink thing. And that as it collapsed beneath him, it seemed to age. It sort of crumpled and wrinkled and sagged, and it went from being this beautiful, beautiful young woman to being this hag, this mummy, this cadaver, and before he could complete the act, it was this sort of limp pink flag hanging off his turgid self. The agents in Seattle, that was one scene that she cited specifically. I could change that. But, you know, I went through, and that was another thing I lifted out, and that went into Snuff, my book a couple years ago, which was much more overtly about, you know, the sex industry. So that was the book, and no matter how bad they are, there are these moments that you can transplant. There's a good kidney in there. You can get that out. So it's not a waste. Even when you think, short term, that was a waste of my time, long term, you'll see that was not a waste of your time. None of that. So. Is there a sort of a unified field principle to my work? You know, this is going to sound so loser-ish, but I didn't really have friends, not long-term friends, until I started writing. You know, I had friends that were based on proximity. We were in the same class, we lived in the same neighborhood, we worked in the same job. But as soon as those circumstances, that proximity was gone, we weren't friends anymore. And starting in 1990, in Tom Spanbauer's workshop, I started meeting with people with whom I shared a common passion, writing. And I still meet with those same people 20 years later. Every Thursday, we get together around a table and we discuss each other's work. And we've watched each other get divorced and have kids. And people in the group have died. And we've shared all of these things as a group, and these are the longest lasting friendships I have ever had. And so the act of writing that you would think of as a solitary, isolating pastime has more than anything else brought me together with people and given me a way to be with people. And it's odd that writing, which is a pastime that you do by yourself, is this way to be with people. And so all of my books are about people who have achieved an isolation that they thought would bring them happiness. You know, if I could just make enough money, I could move away from all you other sons of bitches. I could live in a castle, or I could live in a Howard Hughes penthouse, and I wouldn't have to deal with traffic. Or if I was so beautiful, I want to be so beautiful that I'll be above it all. I'll be Grace Kelly, and people just look and they'll be so intimidated, no one will ever approach me. Or I'll be so smart, they'll always be right, and I'll never be wrong. I'll be the authority of everything. So we all have these ways of achieving this isolation that we're taught should make us happy. A gated community kind of thing. But once we achieve that, we find that we're more miserable than we ever dreamed we could be. And so we kind of destroy those circumstances in order to reintroduce ourselves to life. We pull a kind of Mariah Carey where we throw the telephone at somebody's head and then cut all our hair off and scream and yell. And we destroy all of our power because we cannot bear the isolation that our power has brought us. So all of my books are about coming to this place, about destroying isolation in order to be back with people. And on that note, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.